Welcome, everyone, to another Silk Road seminar. I've been looking forward to this for quite some time. This has been quite a bit of time in the making. There was a connection uh, with Dr. Andani not that long ago, but it was in COVID, and then things sort of did what happened in COVID, and then reached out again, and I'm just so happy you're here. So. Um, Khalil reached out to me because he said he comes from an Islamic tradition in which Neoplatonism plays a very prominent role. And I thought that's very important and appropriate for the philosophical Silk Road because I've been exploring the possibilities in which Neoplatonism can form a philosophical Silk Road between Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And so that is at least the initial place from where we will begin our conversation. But first, Khalil, could you just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself and why you reached out to me and so forth?
Sure. So, my name is Khalil Andani. I'm actually from Canada, grew up in Toronto, and after a short career as an accountant, I decided to switch and pursue my passion, which was the study of religious thought. And academically, I'm trained in Islamic studies, namely the intellectual history of Islam. And anyone who studies the intellectual history of Islam will run into this sort of family of Islamic thought, which I call Islamic Neoplatonism.
Right.
Right. And there are multiple traditions in Islam that are Neoplatonic, that have taken inspiration from Neoplatonic writers, translated into Arabic. So, one of the traditions I specialize in studying academically, historically, is the Ismaili tradition, which is also the tradition that I come from myself. And I, part of my research, doctoral research and related research, I found myself having to read Muslim Neoplatonic texts like very, very closely just to even understand what
Mm-hmm.
is being said and what is the worldview of so many Muslim thinkers. And the popularity of Neoplatonism in Islam, it's one of those things that transcends sectarian division.
Right.
So once you tap into it, you now have the ability to understand the worldview of a Muslim thinker, whether he's Sunni or whether he's Shi'i or whether he's Sufi or whether he's a peripatetic philosopher and so on. And through my, decade over a decade of research, I found that actually Neoplatonism as a worldview is a very viable
Mm-hmm.
project,
Mm-hmm.
especially today, both from a Muslim perspective. That is, I am of the view that if one really wants to make sense of Islamic theology, belief, and practice, uh, having a Neoplatonic worldview underpinning one's Islamic faith is very, very valuable,
Mm-hmm.
both at the level of practice, i.e., have you ever wondered, like, well, why do Muslims pray, and why do Muslims pray the way they do, right? What is the point of all this? Why all these gestures? So one way of intellectually, strengthening one's spiritual life, in my opinion, is to hold a Neoplatonic worldview. The other side that I saw of this is today, and I'm sure you've been privy to this, there are many theological interfaith discussions, philosophical discussions among people about viable models of God, viable models of the God world relationship, viable solutions to the problem of evil, for example, suffering, all these things. And I found that at an intellectual level, Neoplatonism has some of the best answers
Mm-hmm.
to these questions, or whether one is a Muslim or whether one is a Jew or a Christian or even like a Hindu. Like the Neoplatonic model has resources that actually address, in my opinion anyway, many of the problems raised in the philosophy of religion. So I found it very intellectually compelling. So many years ago, I thought to myself that uh, in addition to the historical work that I'll always be doing as an academic and as an assistant professor of religion, um, it was also going to be an individual project of my own
Ah.
to revive Neoplatonism. as a form of thought. And that is around when I sort of stumbled upon your work. It was actually some of the people that interviewed you, Sam Tideman.
Yeah.
I don't know if you remember from the
Yes, I do.
Transfigured
Yeah.
channel. He pointed me in your direction. He said, "Oh, you really need to talk to John, and you guys would have a great time." So I've been inspired by seeing the conversations you've had, especially because you approach this from a different perspective. Like I
Mhm.
approach this primarily from a metaphysical, theological perspective. You're approaching it from this more cognitive perspective, which is very much part of the tradition. So I thought it was an opportunity to dialogue with you and learn sort of a different route through this tradition. And I mean, I just published something, and there was a great quote from I forgot the name of the author, but a great author said that Neoplatonism is one of the most enduring yet understudied intellectual
Yeah.
traditions
Yeah.
in the entire history of philosophy. So I'm very excited to partake in this dialogue with you.
That's fantastic, Khalil. I mean, this is I mean, you're bearing witness to something that I've been arguing for, which is this tremendous capacity for Neoplatonism to weave itself through multiple religious traditions. And then also, as you pointed out, with my own work, the work in 4E cognitive science, the recent work on biology, especially the work on Michael Levin, some work in physics like Wolfgang Smith's work, all this stuff keeps converging back towards a Neoplatonic view. And then, of course, there's been the recent resurgence of work in Neoplatonism, especially recapturing some of its phenomenological aspects, so it doesn't come off as just this dry intellectual propositional affair, but is actually a living tradition. And I guess maybe that's where I want to start first with you. There's so much I want to talk to you about because there's so many connections here. Uh, but you said that um, Neoplatonism, in some sense, empowers or affords or enhances your personal practice, your religious practice, your spiritual practice. Could you tell me a little bit more about that? Like, what does that for? So, one question I might have is: are there practices that were like Islamic and then have been reformed or transformed by Neoplatonism, or have you found that there are some practices from the Neoplatonic heritage that you've brought into Islam and they're homed well there? There's a couple different things that you could have meant. So what do you mean there?
Sure, I'll give you some examples. So, generally, what I've seen happen by certain Islamic traditions is they have Neoplatonized Islamic practices. And
Mm,
in doing so, they Islamicize Neoplatonism. So,
right,
that's like the big picture. But let me give you some examples. So, we have until today a number of Islamic traditions of belief and practice that adhere to a Neoplatonic worldview, which and that worldview looks very similar to the framework first put forth by Plotinus,
right, right.
right? And then, as you know, uh, Plotinus's model, which I call the standard model, did get modified by Proclus and
Yeah, yeah,
by Iamblichus. It
yes,
becomes a little more fat in a
yeah.
sense. So you see the Islamic traditions doing the same thing. So if I were to generalize, I would say that today there are at least four, at least, so there could be more, but there are at least four Islamic traditions that continue to be Neoplatonic in
Could you
their
name them,
doctrine.
please? Could you name them, please?
Yes, yeah. So the first would be the Ismaili tradition. That's the tradition that I belong to. So, very quickly, Ismailis are a Shia denomination of Islam who believe in the spiritual authority of a lineage of imams, spiritual leaders
Right.
directly descended from Prophet Muhammad. And if you were watching the news in the last couple of months, um, the 49th Imam of the Ismailis, Aga Khan IV, passed away
Oh,
recently in
okay.
February. I don't know if you know, he received honorary degrees at University of Toronto.
Oh,
Um,
I didn't know
and
that.
yeah, and his son, the 50th Imam, just succeeded. So that tradition, the Ismaili tradition, which today is very publicly known for its humanitarian work, but this is a Neoplatonic tradition, one of the earliest
Mm, mm,
in Islam. So Neoplatonism as a worldview has actually continued within the Ismaili tradition, which is to say, the terminology, the doctrines that Ismailis still believe in today make reference to, for example, the intellect,
Right.
the
News.
nous.
Yeah, yeah.
Ismailis still refer to that, but they use a more, you could say, indigenous term. Like instead of saying the word nous, if you go to Ismaili and you say, "Do you believe in the nous?" they might not know what you mean. But if you say, "Do you believe in the light?"
Right.
or the
Yeah, yeah.
Arabic word nur, "Do you believe in the nur?" they'll be like, "Oh yeah, absolutely."
Right.
And if you ask Ismaili Muslims today, like, what is the goal of your spiritual life or your prayer life, they'll answer something like it's to become closer and attain union with the light.
Mm,
Now,
mm,
that light in Ismaili texts is often described as the Neoplatonic intellect. It's
right.
often called the first intellect, the universal intellect, this
Right.
sort of thing. So, what Ismaili philosophers used to do back, 1,000 years ago, even just hundreds of years ago, is when they would explain the meaning of Islamic prayers, uh, I'll use something very simple. Um, Muslim prayers have many gestures within them,
Hmm.
right? And if you watch the news, you'll see this. So if you see a clip of Muslims praying, one type of gesture is a bowing.
Yes.
This is like a where you're bowing, but you're not fully on the ground, right?
Yes.
And then the second gesture is called a prostration, where like your head touches the ground. So there's
Hmm.
bowing, which you it's technically called genuflection, but I'll call it bowing, and there's prostration. So in Ismaili text from 1,000 years ago, which I've published and written on, explains the inner meaning of prayer. And what they say is and the author's name is Nasir Khusro, and again I've published on this, so it's on my academia. He explains that when the worshiper goes into a bowing position and recites a particular name of God, and the Arabic, the recitation has a particular divine name, Al Azim, which means the great. The worshiper should realize that symbolically, the act of bowing and reciting the divine name, Al Azim, refers to the universal soul,
Oh, I see.
the world soul. So you're supposed to think of the world soul when you bow,
Oh, wow.
right? And then it goes on, when the worshiper goes into a full prostration, now the head is touching the ground, and they recite another name of God, which is the name means the Most High. The name is Al Ali,
Right.
the Most High. That divine name refers to the intellect. And the act of fully prostrating means the worshiper symbolically unites with the intellect.
I see. Is there anything that it corresponds to the one, or relationship to the one? Yeah. Or,
Yes,
yeah.
there are, but remember, in in many Islamic traditions who hold to Neoplatonism, right, and similar to Plotinus, the one is beyond predication.
Right. 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 Right.
So then you have to be careful when you're looking at divine names that one recites, that a person recites. In truth, the the divine names all fall short of the one,
Of course. I mean
right?
that's very standard. What I meant is there a practice in which someone like Plotinus might realize henosis, that state of at one minute? Is that something that is acknowledged or sought after within your tradition?
That is unity with the one.
Yes.
That is acknowledged. So there are Ismaili texts. So, for example, Nasir bin Tusi, great Islamic philosopher, astronomer, he wrote a text outlining the different levels toward unity with the one.
Mm,
And he does talk about how, at the level of the one, there's no worshiper and there's no worship.
of course.
There's no subject, there's no object. Like the worshiper at the level of the one, to have that experience, has to negate himself or herself. Like you can't exist, because at the one there's only the one. So
Right.
you do have, this is talked about, but at a more mundane level, I'll give you an example where reference is made to the one. So when the way most Muslims pray, they begin their prayer by saying Allahu Akbar.
Hmm.
Again, sadly, the media, due to the news, that term now gets associated with negative things.
Of
But
course.
Allahu Akbar is how most Muslims begin a prayer. Now, what does that phrase mean? It just means God is greater.
Hmm.
And Ismaili texts interpret that
I
as
ah
a reference to the one.
right, right, right.
Right? The one is greater than all description. The one is greater than all predicates. So when you say Allahu Akbar, you're referring to the one in like one of the only ways that you could refer to the one.
So,
So
so
this is just the Ismaili tradition, but you know there are like we in addition to the Ismailis, we have Sufis.
yes,
So the Sufi tradition associated with Ibn Arabi
yeah,
and a whole bunch of commentators of Ibn Arabi, that is Neoplatonic.
yes,
You know, um, the 12er Shia. So this is another Shia group. Majority of Iranians, for example, are 12 or Shia. Half of Iraqis are 12 or Shia. A good number of Lebanese, a good number of South Asians, and they're the largest Shia denomination today. Much of the 12 or Shia tradition is Neoplatonic.
mm,
So if you pick up a text by a 12 or scholar, even living today, they'll like go on and out. They'll talk about the one, and they'll talk about the intellect and the
right.
soul. So that tradition is Neoplatonic as well. And then you also have today. I don't know how many these people there are, but there are Muslims who continue to follow Avicenna, the
Really?
teachings of Avicenna. Yeah, I can't tell. Like they're not a community per se, but there are thinkers within different communities who still follow Ibn Sina's understanding,
Right.
and that is also Neoplatonic
Yes, yes.
tradition. And then we also have again, I don't know if they're a community, but there are people who follow Suhrawardi,
Well,
who
yeah, yeah,
you're familiar
yes.
with.
Yeah, yeah. He's one of the people I'm going to be meeting on the philosophical Silk Road,
Yeah.
the philosophy of
So
illumination.
these traditions exist,
Right,
and people like so you still have Muslims, myself included, who have in mind a Neoplatonic orientation when we practice our faith, and whose communities, even when they're not, even when a community member is not learned in the tradition, they're still using vocabulary
right,
like nur or light or God or the one. I mean, a very basic example. All Muslims, when they pray, recite a particular chapter of the Quran, chapter 112, called Surat al Ikhlas. Anyone who reads Surat al Ikhlas, even in English, will be struck at how Neoplatonic it is.
mm.
So in English, it says, say, He is God, the absolute one.
Oh, wow.
God is independent or undivided. He did not beget, nor was he begotten, and there is nothing like him.
Right, right.
That's what it says. It's very easy to read this and say, well, this is talking about the one. In fact, Professor Juan Cole, who's an expert on Islam and late antiquity, in his book and some of his articles, he's basically said that this surah of the Quran encapsulates Plotinus's teaching on the one.
What does well, first of all, there's two things I want to ask you. This is very, you're really sparking my interest a lot. One is, I'll say them both, and so I don't forget them. Uh, one is, are there practices analogous to like the contemplative practices that were predominant in Greek Neoplatonism? And of course, there was also rituals. There was theurgia. There's also so there's theoria, theurgia, and then there's the possibility of theosis, things like that. Um, are there contemplative practices that go with these traditions that are recognizably similar to those practiced by the pagan Neoplatonists, or uh, uh, and then the second question is, as somebody who's obviously training themselves and to step back and reflect on this from a wider intellectual framework. You're an academic, right? But so you're both in and outside, which is great, right? I think that's really important. You're both within a tradition, but in your scholastic tradition, you're also outside, right, trying to take the stance of other people looking in. Um, what does that say to you? Like what how is it typically interpreted that, here's some Greeks in a largely polytheistic pagan world, and predating, indubitably predating Muhammad by centuries, and coming up with this? What's their status, and what does that mean? And so those are the two questions. The one is like, I'm trying to get a little bit more. I understand prayer, but even with, you can even see Christianity when it's touching its own Neoplatonic tradition, and also from that talking with a Buddhist tradition, developing these, recovering these kinds of, prayers of the heart, these more meditative practices, these more contemplative practices. So that's the practice side, and then the philosophical question is, well, how is that interpreted? I mean, so you could so I'm, for example, I'm looking at early Christianity right now, Justin Martyr and Clement and Origen, and and there's this really tough thing going on. They're trying to figure out how can they sort of baptize these Greeks, who know nothing of Christ, as they like to say, and there's this great struggle. So that's just to give you a comparison. So those are my two questions. Answer
Sure.
whichever one you want to answer first.
I mean, let's start with the second one. So, I think that Muslims have a much easier time looking back and adopting and affirming so-called pre-Islamic
Right.
traditions of thought, because the Quran is very clear, saying that God sent a messenger to every single nation on earth.
Mm,
And although the Quran only names 25 messengers, and they're predominantly biblical characters, the Quran is very clear that we have sent messengers, it says, that we have not named,
mm,
we have not told you about. And this explains why, very early on, Muslim empires and Muslim intellectuals from the 700s onward very freely read Judeo Christian, Jewish Christian literature, Zoroastrian literature, Greek literature, Indian literature, and all this literature was very quickly translated into Arabic.
mm, mm.
This was a state-sponsored translation movement. So texts in Syriac and Greek and many other languages, they were very quickly translated into Arabic, and they were studied by Muslim scholars of all types, because there was already a prior commitment to the belief that God has inspired people in the past, right? And that a true Muslim, I mean, there was this belief that a true Muslim, especially a true Muslim leader, will have mastery over the entire heritage of human
Really?
knowledge. Yeah, this is what motivated the Abbasid caliphs and the Fatimid caliphs to maintain libraries
Mm,
and to sponsor scholars. It was believed that the true Muslim leader, the true Imam of the time, will have a mastery and will give people access to the entire intellectual heritage of humankind. So
mm.
there was always this openness. So it's actually not very difficult
Right.
uh, as a Muslim to say, okay, the Greeks have divine truth, or the Indians have divine truth. And I mean, apart from the Greeks, if you look at what happens in India under Muslim rule, they translate some of the Sanskrit scriptures to Persian.
Mm, right.
I mean, like, their entire books written on this. One of my colleagues, I believe, Shankar Nair, he's a professor in the U.S. and I think he's written an entire book about like the Sanskrit to Persian translation movement. So this is not a very difficult thing to look at. Also, because there's been a lot of research even into what counts as paganism
Mm-hmm.
exactly. Like in the Quran, the Quran condemns idol worship, but a lot of studies into the Quran have found that what we call idol worship, it's not something left field. It's actually just part of the continuum of what we also call monotheism.
Right.
You
Right.
know,
Right.
so those dividing lines are not as big between monotheism and paganism as we're told, like especially in
Right. Right.
normative religious education. Now, in my own tradition, the Ismaili tradition, it's particularly easy because one of the Ismaili imams, Aga Khan III, who died in 1957, he wrote in the 1950s. He basically said that Socrates was a divinely inspired messenger of God.
Wow, I didn't know that.
So if an Ismaili Imam said that, it's a clear affirmation that now not just Socrates, but the Socrates tradition, which many believe goes to Plato,
Yeah.
Aristotle, and goes all through these commentators, this entire tradition has, in a sense, from an Ismaili perspective, been sanctioned
Wow.
to learn from. And it's not just Ismailis. I'm sure you've come across, there are references in other Muslim texts, Sufi texts,
Yep.
to the divine Plato,
Yes.
Aflatun,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Yeah. 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 That I knew about. Yeah.
Yeah,
Wow.
so this is very easy from a Muslim perspective. Now, I think in the current political climate, because of the aftermath of colonialism and occidentalization, some Muslims today are now like hesitant, like, oh well, this is foreign. But this is a very new attitude. Whereas the standard Muslim madrasa curriculum over the past, I don't know, 400, 500 even more.
Khalil, you dropped out for a sec. Could you just repeat what you said? You were about to list how long the tradition has been around. Wait a sec, Ben. I'm not hearing him.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, now I can hear you. Yeah, the sound's
Okay.
caught up. Okay, start again, please.
Yeah. So, just speaking of the Muslim engagement with Greek thought, for at least 500 years, if not more, the standard curriculum in Muslim madrasas under the Ottoman Empire, the Safavid Empire, the Mughal Empire, the madrasa curriculum, so like the standard curriculum for a Muslim student, included uh, Aristotelian and Neoplatonic materials.
Right, right.
So, for example, you would have to learn about the 10 Aristotelian categories. Like that was just part of your education. Many people would read a Neoplatonic text about the one and 10 intellects,
Hmm.
for example. This is a book called Hidayat al Hikmah by Abhari. Like this was just part of the education in the past. So now this is over, by the way. Okay, like they don't learn this anymore,
Right.
but they did. Now let's move to your second question. Right, was about practices. So to be fair, I'm not an expert in the Greek
Right.
Neoplatonic practices. I don't know the details of that. What I can tell you is um, I'm not aware of Muslims directly incorporating a Greek uh, theoric or theurgic practice
Hmm.
into Islam, but what I am aware of is indigenous Islamic practices that get interpreted
I see.
within that lens. So let's take in Sufism, as well as in, I would say all Muslims have this tradition of chanting the divine names,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? It's called zikr or dhikr. You chant the divine name, either you chant it silently or you might chant it aloud. Now, here's the thing, what names do you chant? Well, if you have a spiritual guide, like a Sufi teacher or an Ismaili Imam, the spiritual guide will assign a particular name or names to the disciple,
Hmm.
right? Why those names? Well, there's this idea that each divine name refers to one of the Neoplatonic hypostases or refers to a particular aspect of one hypostasis.
Hmm. Yes. Right.
And the idea is when you chant that divine name, you internalize the divine name. So that divine name sort of becomes part of yourself. And in doing so, the divine name opens up this connection between your soul and your intellect and the universal soul and the universal intellect.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
divine name, as you know, if you're a Neoplatonist, um, you cannot look at petitionary prayer the way that your neighbor does, right? So you know when most people were taught to pray, you know, even in our communities, you're taught, okay, if you really have this need, you know, ask God, and if you pray really hard, God will be convinced
Yeah.
to do something different. And if you're in certain traditions, this is true in Catholicism, Orthodoxy, Shia Islam, Sufi Islam, you'll also be taught to pray to a saint,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? Now, the standard view is God can be moved by your prayer, right? And if you pray to a saint or a prophet or an imam, they'll pray to God for you, and their prayer will move God, and then God will intervene. Like this
Right.
is sort of like the children's understanding and the mass understanding. But wait, if you're a Neoplatonist like us, that belief doesn't make any sense
That's right. That's right.
because the one does not change. Like
Yeah.
the one is immutable.
Hmm.
Furthermore, the nous doesn't change either. And the soul, the world soul, is also not like it's dynamic, but it's not changing in this discrete manner. So you have to now reinterpret what prayer is, or rather correctly interpret what prayer is. And this is something that again the pre-modern authors already believe this, but I found it worthwhile to write an entire essay um, to explain this to people. So now what does prayer do? Well, now prayer, and this is very similar to the concept behind Neoplatonic theurgy, right?
Hmm. Yes.
Prayer does not affect the one, the intellect, or the soul, the world soul. What does it affect? It affects us. So if I pray for myself, the strength of my prayer, all the energy I put into my prayer, it acts on me. Like it makes myself more receptive
Yeah.
to
Receptivity. Yeah.
receiving the
Yeah.
emanation that's coming from the one through the intellect and the soul. Like that's what prayer does for me. But wait, I can also pray for others, and others can pray for me. So if I appeal to the Prophet Muhammad, many Muslims will, I'm putting it in quotes, pray to the Prophet Muhammad in the sense that they'll ask Prophet Muhammad for something.
Right.
Many Muslims will pray to the Imams, like Prophet Muhammad's cousin, Ali. Um, Shia Muslims pray to their Imams. Ismaili Muslims, we pray to our Imams. Again, I'm using the word pray in quotes in the English sense of to make an appeal to,
Mhm.
not in the sense of worship.
Right.
So Ismailis and 12er Shia, they'll say, Ya Ali Madad, oh Ali help. Like talking, they're talking to their Imam, the first Imam. Sunnis might say Ya Muhammad, or they might pray to a saint. So now, Neoplatonically, this makes sense, but in this particular way. When you pray to an intermediary, it could be a prophet, an imam, a saint, it could be Jesus, it could be Mary, right? You're not asking the intermediary to convince God to do something because God is unchanging. So, what are you really doing? Well, you're asking the intermediary to pray for you. And that intermediary, as a soul, is believed to be a living presence within the Neoplatonic cosmos. So that intermediary, let's say it's the Prophet Muhammad, he is aware of your call for help, and the Prophet prays for you. And what the Prophet's prayer does is it makes you more receptive.
Right. Right. Right.
So in that sense, the intermediary, in a literal sense, mediates the emanations that come from the one that fall upon the intermediary soul, and the intermediary, his prayer or her prayer opens up your soul to receiving those emanations.
Yeah. This is very similar to the Neoplatonic interpretation of theurgia and prayer. It's very, very similar. So that's very interesting. Uh, I'm really glad I'm talking to you about this. How vibrant it is. Uh, it's 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 astonishing how similar Neoplatonism is within Eastern Orthodoxy, especially in the names of God in Dionysius. And you're invoking the names of God, and you've got a reinterpretation of theurgia and of theoria. And there's very similar moves going on. And again, that leads me to my next question, which is more of a philosophical question than a doctrinal question, which is like, what's going on here? Why are these different things from, presumably some very different presuppositions, historical, cultural context? Why do you think they're converging on this? Why do they keep coming to this, and then they keep doing the same kind of things to get it to fit where they came from? Did that make sense as a question? Do you know what I'm trying to? Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. So I've heard you say, and I'm in agreement with this, and I've said this as well, that um, Neoplatonism to me seems like the metaphysical theory of everything, right? And
yeah,
it does seem like that. Now, to your question, why do so many traditions, like different religious traditions, seem to converge on this metaphysical template? There'll be two answers, right? The historian in me, at the level of historicism, I will try to give you a historical account of the transmission of ideas,
yes,
which, as you know, in academia, everybody loves to do this, right? Like you can make your entire career arguing for idea transmission. Like somehow ideas are in the air like a virus and everybody just picks them up. I mean, this is a very common thing. And I've written articles making such claims, this person gets it from this person. And
yeah,
I'm sure that that is going on. Like I'm sure that is going on. However, personally, I find that explanation, although true at its own level, it's still limited. And my own view, not as an academic, because I can't prove this academically, but as a philosopher and as a metaphysician, is I think the reason why we have convergence is because at the end of the day, reality is one and truth is one. And I believe that every religious tradition which contains seekers of truth who are wayfaring on this, I believe everybody is arriving at the same destination
mhm,
through, of course, mediated through their own practices, through their own vocabulary, through their own dogmas. But because reality is objective at the end of the day, and I believe reality is objective, not necessarily physical reality, but reality.
mhm.
So if reality is objective, then there are objective truths that many people within many traditions are going to arrive at. Uh, Almost like we're all spiritual scientists with very limited equipment, discovering like the same plane of reality, and then our interpretive mechanisms allow us to describe this in a very limited way. But even the limited descriptions will see this convergence. So when a long time ago, I wrote an article comparing Meister Eckhart's view of the Trinity
Mhm.
to the Ismaili Neoplatonists, for example. Um, and but I had also read some of the perennialists, and I'm not a full perennialist. I could say I'm a soft perennialist.
Yeah.
Um, but you could find a metaphysical template, not just between, let's say, the Trinity and the Neoplatonic triad, but also you look in Taoism, you can find something there with Wu Qi and Tai Chi. So, like, the Taoists have this idea of the one, like the ineffable one.
I've been a practicer of Tai Chi, a player of Tai Chi Chuan
Yeah.
for over 3 decades. Yes.
So if I'm sure if you read Rene Renon's book, The Great Triad, he talks about the metaphysical triads in
Mm,
Taoism. It's very similar to the Neoplatonic triad. Very, very similar. In Hinduism, you'll find these ideas as well. You have Purusha and Prakriti, for example, in one sort of Hindu metaphysical tradition, or you have Vishnu and Brahma. Like the Vishnu and Brahma very much look like the intellect and the soul. So I do believe that this convergence is not just due to historical transmission, although that definitely is happening. I think it's because we are converging on the same reality.
so just to first amplify that a little bit and then come back to a question. Um, so there's now what's called the Platonic representation hypothesis within work and machine learning, which is you can take various AIs with different architecture, start with different kinds of initial data sets, even have different objectives. But if you make them complex and rich enough, they converge on the same sort of ontology. They come, and the idea here is what's going on there, and it's something like reality itself starts to constrain, right, the representational structure. And it's called the Platonic representation hypothesis for an obvious reason. It's the idea that there are these paradigmatic patterns that constitute intelligibility and realness. I thought that's really interesting. Just to add that in, it's what I mean is you making what's called a convergence argument. Like you, I acknowledge the historical diffusion, but there seems to be a convergence above and beyond what can be accounted for well by the diffusion, and there's no historical diffusion going on in the machine learning. So that
Mm.
really buttresses the idea. No, there's something going on that's driving the convergence outside of historical diffusion. So I thought I'd just buttress your argument with some more recent evidence. Now, an interesting question there is like, what is the nature of that constraint? And you said objective, but you said not necessarily physical. That's interesting because there's three possible ways in which people have. One is you could be a Jungian and say, well, that's because the psyche which is basically a Kantian thing. The psyche has this kind of structure, and therefore, wherever there are human beings, they will impose this kind of structure because that's the structure of, that's the structure that the mind imposes on the world in order to make human sense of it. Sort of a Kant Jungian answer. There's the Platonic answer, which is, well, no, there's an organization, an intrinsic organization to intelligibility that constrains what can be known and how it can be known, and that's kind of a Platonic realism. That's not. I get it. That's I'm not attributing to you a sort of a simple reductionism or a simple physicalism or anything like that. And then there's another one which um, um, uh, you have in certain kinds of traditions where you have sort of a dialogical idea that there's a synergistic relationship between the grammar of the human mind and the grammar of reality, and that in, like, to use William Desmond language, in that between, in that metaxu, another Platonic term, right, that is where, right, they're both co-contributing to why this kind of structure of intelligibility keeps emerging. And I think you can make a good case for all of these coming out of the Platonic tradition. Jung is basically the Plato of the psyche in a lot of ways. And then you have sort of a classic standard Platonic realism. And then you have this more recent, right? Well, it's metaxological, the idea that it's co-created, which lines up really nicely with a lot of 4E cog sci, the kind of cog sci. So, what do you think about those three options, and what, like, where might you land on them, or are you sort of open or agnostic, or what do you think?
Um, I would say that I would probably land on the third if that's what's on the tray.
Yeah.
Uh, eh, Here's why I would say that. Again, this is just on first blush. Um, as you know, some kind of Platonism is becoming more popular, especially among people who study math and computer
Yep.
science and this
Yeah,
sort
it's
of thing.
very much biology now. The new biology work of Michael Levin is thoroughly Neoplatonic and in a very rigorous fashion. Yeah, very much.
What I just find is, without denying Jungian archetypes, I don't feel like I'm in a place to really say that's wrong. You
Mm,
know, I don't study psychology, but even if you just take it as is, and then on the other hand, if this sort of modern type of Platonism, Platonic realism, which posits a sort of Platonic realm, where you have like the objectivity of mathematics and other such things, right? My only issue with those versus Neoplatonism is that I just don't think they explain enough of what we need to explain. So generally, I would say that there's at least three facets of the world as we experience it that need to be explained by a worldview. The first is existence.
hmm
Like the sheer existence of anything requires an explanation
hmm
without accounting for whether it's a cat or a dog or a star, but just the fact that anything exists. So
Yes. Yeah.
that requires an explanation. The sheer existence of things. And that explanation is only the one, an absolutely simple, independent, unconditioned reality. Only that can explain the existence of any kind of reality.
Right. Right. Well, the
So
reason I brought, oh, so go ahead, finish your
yeah,
thoughts.
so
Sorry.
so that's just the first thing that needs to be explained, existence, right? Because and you know, you arrive at that question subjectively. Like when we ask, well, I exist. So think about it from our perspective. um like Descartes, you can deny the physical world, you can even doubt your own thoughts, right? You know, you might doubt the existence of yourself, although Descartes won't. um he'll affirm it. But even if you did, you know what you can't doubt? That there is existence.
Hmm.
You
Hmm.
can't doubt that. Even if you doubt your existence, there's still existence in general that's being affirmed. So that's the first question. Why is there existence? And the answer to that is the Neoplatonic one. And there's no other, and this is just my opinion, of course, and many will disagree with me. I have many friends, colleagues in the philosophy of religion who are not Neoplatonist at all, and I debate them for fun, you know,
Yeah,
collegially.
of
We have
course.
debates about this. So many people say no, but I'll say, look, in my view, where I stand, only the one can explain existence. uh, a personal God who is metaphysically complex is not the one.
Yes, I agree with that, and I think that's important. You know, and you have Spinoza's argument, and I tend to think I belong to the camp that sees Spinoza in the line of Neoplatonism,
Yes,
which is a growing camp.
I
That
do
it
too.
makes no sense to talk about more than one ultimate reality. That is an utter oxymoronic absurdity. So you have
Yeah.
to do that. So it's not just an existence argument. It's kind of like because the problem with exist the problem I have with existence is sort of classic Kantian arguments. Existence isn't a predicate. I know what you mean, but the thing that is a predicate is realness. But realness ultimately points us towards an ultimate reality
Hmm.
because, and there can't be more than one of those or something like that. That would be
Yeah.
my sort of uh, uh,
Yeah.
version of your
And
argument.
not only, I mean, there can only be one ultimate reality, and it has to be simple.
It cannot, and it has to, yeah. So the language I use is it has to be absolutely non-dual, which
Yeah.
means it is the relation underneath all possible dichotomies of thought.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
this reality, you could say non-dual. That I'm using this more scholastic term, simple, but we're saying the same thing. So
Yes.
there are no distinctions within the one. There's not even the distinction of subject and object, right? And this is where, as you know, Plotinus takes a different, he takes issue with Aristotle, because
Yes.
Aristotle's supreme principle is a self-thinking thinker, in which case you still have a sort of a duality between the thinker
Which
and
is
the
one of the
thought.
problems. Yes, is one of the
Yeah,
problems, as you said, with a personal, metaphysically complex God. I
yeah.
think I think that's a very important point. Um,
So
I,
that explains existence, or if I want to be more precise, the one explains the the fact of dependent realities. Like, why are there any dependent realities at all? It's because of the one.
yeah, the reason why I was I was not trying to replace. I was trying to add to simplicity non-dualities. And you see this worry in Plotinus because when people hear simple, they think the numerical simplicity.
Yes. Yeah.
They think singleness, and the one
Hmm.
is not singleness. That so it's not that sense of simplicity, and it's also not. It's not sort of a homogeneous in because it overflows into everything else.
Hmm.
Um, that's why I was trying to emphasize. I want to bring out the fact that it's not a homogeneous or a singleness that is being
Yeah.
pointed to with this notion.
Yeah. So that explains existence or dependent realities. But what we still need more to do, right? So my problem with a lot of today's natural theology is they'll run like one argument and like a contingency argument, which is similar to what we're saying, and then they'll be like, okay, I'm done, like let's go home, like we did
Yeah.
everything. But like that's not a complete intellectual project, because we still need to explain intelligibility,
Yes, exactly.
because
Exactly.
existence not only is here, it's intelligible to us.
And the deep, profound primordial presupposition that there is some non-numerical, non-logical unity between intelligibility and realness. Because if
Yeah.
that is not the case, then we are sucked. We are worse than Descartes in his worst nightmare.
Yes. Yeah. So now, we to explain intelligibility, what do we mean by that? Well, the intelligibility of any existence. Like, why is it intelligible? Why is it intelligible at all? Well,
Mhm.
that there's two things to explain: the intelligibility of the objects, and also the intelligibility of the subject. Right? Like, why do we have this capacity to intellect in the first place? Why does this even exist? Right? And then, why is there something to be intellected? And then, if people don't like that, or they want to attribute that to something else, I often say, well, there are a number of eternal necessary truths that they're just intelligible in themselves. Like, even if the universe didn't exist, I would argue, um, logical truths would still exist. The laws of logic would still exist. Mathematical objects, mathematical truths would still exist. There's even some good there's some good articles where, if you just sit down and think about it for about an hour, you could sort of list off a lot of eternal what they call eternal truths, basically, like negation and affirmation, truths about math, universals, circularity, even moral truths. Even, like, if you believe in some, not all, but if you believe some truths are like eternally true regarding morals, those need explanation, right?
And your
So,
point is they're not atomic with respect to each other. Their individual intelligibility is nested within a whole, like they all are woven together in some profound way.
yeah, because all these eternal truths, they're all related to
Yeah.
each other. That you could even build them out from a tree, even. So, the second thing is, okay, how do we explain the very existence of eternal truths and general intelligibility? Now, here's the thing: the Thomists, who I'm sure you've had some interactions with,
Of course.
what the Thomists like to do, and they're not just them, a lot of theists, monotheists, what they will do is they will appeal to the one, or God, to be the explanation of intelligibility and eternal truth. And what they'll do is they'll take the eternal truths and they'll put them
They're
in
the
the one.
ideas. They're ideas in the mind of God, and
Correct.
then, but this is very problematic, right? And you get
Right.
even standard theologians like Craig saying, "Wait, if they're eternal and necessary, they can't be contingently existing thoughts or ideas in the mind of God. If God is free as a free cognitive agent thinking them, then they're
Yeah.
not eternal. And if they're eternal, they do not need to be thought in order to exist." Yes, I find that argument very powerful, by the way.
So, from a Neoplatonist, the only problem a Neoplatonist would have with putting them in God is it renders God internally complex. It makes the one eternally complex, right? The one cannot be constituted by some number of eternal thoughts or ideas, nor can the one be the direct source of a direct multiplicity of eternal thoughts or ideas. That would also render the one internally complex. So, the move that Plotinus makes, and we all after him, we make the same move. Although nobody in the philosophy of religion, like today's journals, is doing this for whatever reason, but we're going to do it. Is we say, okay, there are eternal ideas. They do require an eternal mind or an eternal intellect to sustain them and to think them, but that eternal intellect is not the one. That eternal intellect is the nous, because the nous is singular in its being, but internally it has complexity. And that is what guarantees the intelligibility of anything, the intelligibility of eternal truth. And then it's very simple: the nous cannot be part of the one, because the one is simple, non-dual. So the only way the nous, which is must be eternal, the only way the nous can be related to the one is if it is dependent on the one,
Mhm.
but not part of the one and not inside the one. And that's how you establish the nous,
Yeah,
the intellect.
I think that's right. Um, the dependency is very tricky, like I said, because you don't want eternal truths causally dependent on the one, because that makes them ultimately contingent, right? And then they lose their defining feature being necessary. And this is the problem of the emanation, right, of the one into the nous, which is a besetting problem. And I consider myself a Neoplatonist, so I'm not casting stones, right? Is like what does that emanation look like? And it doesn't look like any model of causation, because it like the dependencies of eternal truths can't be any kind of contingent dependencies. They have to be necessary. So there's some necessary relationship, but it's completely asymmetrical. The one is not necessary
Yeah.
uh, on the
But
new.
but
But
that's totally fine. In Islamic Neoplatonism, all of us quite vocally say that the one emanates or originates or causes the intellect out of the necessity of its own nature.
and this
That,
is
that
yeah,
that's totally fine.
and I agree. Now that brings up two contrasts, right? Before we get to the third, which because you're going to move into the world soul, but before you do,
Yeah,
there's a, which is um, this stands against a sort of standard Christian idea of creation ex nihilo, in which
yeah,
depends on nothing other than God's fiat, God's
right.
pure freedom of choice, and not constrained by even by any kind of rationality or anything. Um, and 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 so there's that. But on the other hand, um, what is the status of the noose? Is it divine?
Okay. Well, a couple of things. So, this depends on your definition of divine.
Yeah.
Right? If divine simply means that which is above the natural world and exercises power over the natural world, then the nous is divine. So I'm going to call it the intellect. So the intellect is divine, and the world soul is divine, and the one is divine. If all that divinity means, like being supernatural and having causal power over the natural world, then all three are divine. But if divine with a capital D means independent and unconditioned, which is how Muslims use the term divine, then only the one is divine. And the intellect and the soul are eternal creations of the one.
Mhm.
And this is definitely how Muslims saw it. So Muslims who believe in Neoplatonism, they never found the idea of an eternal intellect or an eternal soul to be a threat to God's divinity. Like it was just not an issue for us. Even when we say that the one necessarily emanates the intellect,
Yes.
even that we did not see that, or we do not see that as a threat to the aseity or the quote unquote freedom of the one. And if you're interested in that, I've written an article. This is my first like philosophy article, because again, I'm a historian by profession. My first philosophy article in the European Journal of Analytic Philosophy is about this precise issue of
Yes.
uh, does God create or originate by necessity? And if so, is that a problem? Is it a problem for divine freedom? Is it also a problem for the fact that that would mean everything is ultimately necessary, right? That would mean that everything that happens in the universe has been necessitated by its cause, which ultimately has been necessitated by God. So a lot of Western, like modern day Anglo American Christians are very unhappy with what I just said
Yes.
because they feel like they're not free. But these people are all libertarians,
Yes.
not politically, but philosophically, they want libertarian freedom, which actually, in what I've argued, I think I have of your worldview. So I would say that actually, real freedom real freedom in which the agent, whether you, me, or God, the agent must be in complete control of its product. Like that's real freedom, and that only happens when whatever the agent produces is in accordance with the essence of the agent.
Yes,
Right?
this is
That's real freedom, in my opinion.
Frankfurt's notion of voluntary necessity, where the distinction between being voluntary and being necessary breaks down. And part of Frankfurt's argument is this is actually a quintessential feature of reason. Uh, there's a necessity and a freedom when you follow a great argument. You're
Mm,
compelled, but it's not causally compulsive. So it's not mechanically deterministic in that sense, but it's a deeper kind of necessity. And as we say, perhaps it's a logical necessity. Um, and I think that's right. And then and the point is, a lot of the things we think disclose or have the potential to disclose something deep about reality, like reason, like love, like beauty, all have this characteristic. It doesn't fall cleanly onto the voluntary or necessity the way we are typically thinking about it.
mm. One other thing I would mention, so you sort of brought this up about how the emanation of the nous from the one can be problematic. So this is something where the Muslim Neoplatonists have made a contribution. Although I would argue, and I have an unpublished paper where their solution was already prefigured by Plotinus himself. So if we read Plotinus very carefully, for him, uh, the emanation of the nous actually has two stages.
Yes.
The fully formed nous, which internally is complex, constituted by the forms or the ideas. The fully formed nous with its internal plurality doesn't come directly from the one. Um, what comes from the one directly is a single and singular substance, which Plotinus calls the indefinite dyad,
Yes.
or the intelligible matter.
Yeah, and then in reflecting back on its source, it becomes the full-fledged intellect.
Correct.
Yes.
So the direct emanation from the one is actually only one thing. And in Islamic Neoplatonism, we came up with a term for this. It's called the rule of one.
Oh.
Um, the rule of one basically states that from the one, only one comes forth.
Hmm.
And the argument for this is that uh, because the one is undifferentiated unity, the direct product of the one could only be one effect. If it were any more than one effect, if two effects or three effects or 10 effects directly proceed from the one, it would logically entail that prior to the procession, you already have that number within the one, because one part of the one has to give rise to one effect, and the second effect, which is not the first, it needs to be given rise to by another part of the one, and so on. So the argument, basically like a reductio, right? Once you've already established that the one is undifferentiated unity, it logically follows that the direct product of the one can only be one thing or one entity. So that one entity that proceeds from the one without mediation, it's not the fully formed intellect. Uh, it is uh, a pre intellectual substance. We call it, so theologically, we call it the command of the one. So, Ismailis, we
Yeah.
call it the command of the one. Later, Muslim thinkers call it uh, contingent existence. Like it's just pure contingent existence without an essence yet. Some people call it general existence. Some people call it the existence that is going to be reflected and spread forth in everything else that'll exist. But the point is, the direct uh, flux, outflux of the one is a unity, with the potential for multiplicity, sort of like a seed, like the seed of a tree, right? When the seed is a seed, it doesn't have multiplicity yet, like it's just a seed. And then through subsequent stages, the seed will grow roots, branches, leaves. So what happens then is this direct emanation from the one directly comes forth, and this emanation, uh, it thinks about itself.
Yeah, it's a ground from which there's an emergence, a turning back,
Yeah,
a
it
moving.
turns back, and
Yeah,
the first emanation looks back at the one, and it says, I am not the one. It realizes otherness. It realizes duality from its perspective. Like the first emanation is not the one. So it has to recognize and say to itself, I am not God, or I am not the one. Islamically, we would say that it's the first. This is like reciting the Shahada, like La ilaha illallah. There is no God except God, which is a way of saying I am not God. So that's what that first emanation does. It realizes that I am not God, and that realization, it's not a temporal realization, but it's a logical realization. That realization uh, grounds or gives rise to a quiddity, an identity, an essence for the noose. So
yeah,
now, subsequent to this realization, the noose has two parts now: what directly emanated plus its identity essence. So now it's complex. And further reflections on this internal complexity will get you all those different eternal truths and forms as constituting the noose.
I mean, I think there's a lot in here. Like you said, this is a myth in a sense because it's spoken of in temporal terms, and it can't be a temporal event because then it will fall into deep self contradiction. And I think it has to do with the intertwining of emergence and emanation somehow being one, but not the same. And I think that's the sort of ontological fact it's disclosing. I mean, I, the solution. I mean, uh, the James Filler in his books talks a lot about the and some of his work. He talks about this sort of pure relationality of intellectual matter. It's the potential for
Mhm.
form, and it's not itself any kind of form yet. And I think that's very interesting. I, I mean, I, I, I just said what I thought was very valuable about this and deep about it. I'm not I, I'm aware that the tradition itself doesn't find Plotinus's solution satisfactory, and you get the continual increase in the number of mediators to try and square this circle until by the time of Proclus, and if you know, if you read Proclus, it's this incredibly
Mhm.
complex system of mediators and mediation. Um, now, I don't think we should. I'm not recommending we stop trying to intellectually probe this, but I think there's something about this that we can't get in thought, and that's why we get the endless proliferation of mediators. Um, so, like I said, I think what Plotinus does captures something about the intertwining, the non-duality of emanation and emergence, and it's emanation all the way down and emergence all the way up, as I like to say, um, and that there's a deep kind of continuum there, and that picks up on a lot of the continuums that are found in physics and in biology. But I also note the tradition itself seems to say, don't be satisfied with that because
Mm.
we're not, because we keep multiplying the mediators. Now, since I've turned to to Proclus, what do you think of Proclus's claim? And this is a little bit how I try to put Jung and Plotinus back together. Proclus has this claim that we can only know the one if there is a one within us. If there's a one,
Mm.
if there's something wanting us, and Plotinus does argue that what makes something real is the degree to which it is one,
Yeah.
right? And Proclus says he says, we don't really know the one, we know the one within us, but it
Yeah.
is it participates in the one.
Yes.
Um, what do you think of that?
No, so I would generally agree. And so within the system, the Neoplatonic system that I hold to, which again I could find in Plotinus. So Plotinus actually says that um, the light of the one is present in all beings.
Yes, he
Like
does.
he appeals to something that's not the one, but it's not the news. It's like the light of the one or the grace of the one. The unity of the one has like sort of poured forth and shines within everything. So I believe that's true. But what he's talking about, this unity of the one that's in everything, or the light of the one, this is that first emanation, pre-intellect.
Yes. So
So I
you think,
believe that,
do you think that is what is running all the way through? That's, am
yeah,
I?
yeah.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
so if I give you an analogy, um, the one is like a power source,
yeah, yeah,
a power source. Uh, every hypostasis from the nous to us is a particular bulb
yeah.
with a particular brightness, okay, and a color. Uh, so you have the power source, and then you have the bulbs, and all these bulbs are lit up from the power source. But what is running? What goes from the power source to bulb one to the next bulb? There's some power current, electricity that's running through the whole system. That electricity is not identical to any particular bulb, but it's present in all the bulbs, and it's modulated by each bulb depending on the power of, the wattage and this sort of thing. So in my Neoplatonic system, that first emanation that comes forth from the one before it realizes itself as intellect, that's analogous to this electricity. So each of us, although my bulb is way down in the hierarchy, right? Like there's so many things between the one and me. Yet, by virtue of that emanation or unity that's running through the system, I have a direct, I have a more or less direct relationship to the one, because that power current, that's what I call general existence, right?
It's
That is
being.
a trace that Plotinus and the Ismailis and others, we call it the trace of the one, the
Yes.
imprint of the one. So there's beyond my own intellect. Because my intellect is a participation in the nous, and my soul is a participation in the hypostasis soul. But beyond that, beyond my intellect, there's this trace of the one within you and me, and that gives us this direct access to the one.
It's, yeah, and so your, um, uh, I play with that analogy a little bit. There's the power source, and then the noose is like the network, the grid. It's the structural layout, so that like it conduces and transforms it, and then the individual households,
Yep,
right? And then, but the households, right? They form like a neighborhood, and that's like the world soul.
sure.
But so, but what I'm hearing here, and this has always been a little bit of my concern, and one of the with Plotinus, and what I saw with Iamblichus and with Proclus is there is there is an attempt to counterbalance emanation with emergence, that things are, there's also in, we see in nature a drawing of things together, a
Mm,
self-organizing, a coming into oneness, and then
yep,
those coming into oneness, and even understanding, I group all these things, I group all these things, and then right, and you see this other movement of thought and being which is going the other way. and
yep,
and and then of course later on with Erogena and others, you want to say, well, that's as much the one, right, as the emanation. The return and the
mm,
emanation are equally like the primary disclosures. They're not the one, but they're
yeah.
the primary disclosures. Does that land well with you as well?
Absolutely, because I mean, this sort of brings us to the third part, right? Like the soul now. So the last thing we need to, so like the one explains existence, the nous explains intelligibility. But again, we're not done, because when we look at the cosmos, it's not just a bunch of static intelligible things.
No, it flows.
If everything is in motion, I mean, even in physics now, not there's not one static moment like
Yeah.
in this universe, right? Everything is in motion. So when we look at the motion that we see in the cosmos, Yeah, we do have entropy, right? Principles of disorder. Um, but we also have principles of order, like just the very basic laws of nature, which Einstein calls miraculous,
Yes.
right? Like the fact that we have any laws of nature that are intelligible, these like repeated patterns, these patterns of motion, of organized motion that just keep happening over. Why do we have this? Why don't we live in a chaotic universe where everything is just entropic and that's it? And I'm not making a modern fine tuning argument where I'm saying, oh, the value of the
No, no,
constants
no.
must be like, I'm saying even more general, like why are there physical laws of any kind? Like why are there laws of nature of
Well,
any kind?
I think you're saying something even more general than that. Why is it that when things unfold, there's still an intelligibility within them? They don't
Yeah,
unfold into a kind of inaccessible absurdity. Yes,
correct. So what we have here is we not only have intelligibility, we have what Aristotle might call intelligible motion.
yes, yes.
Right? Intelligible. So we have motion, as Aristotle said, he was right, and motion needs an explanation. But what really needs an explanation is intelligible motion, which people like Stephen Oderberg would call teleological activity. You know,
Or or even just the basic notion of physis, which is what Aristotle's talking about, like physics. Physis is this into where, because the problem, when I understand what you're saying, I just want, this is for the purposes of people listening.
yeah,
Motion for Aristotle doesn't mean locomotion. It's not
yes,
just this. When things are
yeah,
growing, when things are developing or
yeah,
changing, he also calls that intelligible
yeah.
motion.
Any
So
kind of change,
any
any
kind
kind
of,
of
well,
change.
any kind of change that for which we can generate a science,
Yes.
that's what Aristotle is meaning.
Yeah. So the last thing that needs explanation is what you might call goal directed motion, which some, I know you have some gripes with the term teleological, but people like Oderberg use teleological in this grander sort of
Yeah,
sense. So
yeah,
I use the term as he uses it, teleological motion. So ultimately, um, teleological motion or goal directed motion or intelligible motion that the whole cosmos partakes in, there has to be an explanation of that. Now, the one by itself doesn't explain that. And the nous by itself doesn't explain that. There has to be an arche, a hypostasis, right? Which is the arche of intelligible motion. So the hypostasis itself must be in a state of intelligible goal directed motion. And that is what the universal soul
yeah.
does within the model.
So you
The
have the one,
universal soul is itself responsible for bestowing what we today call all the laws of nature. And not only that, like the very human aspiration for seeking intelligibility, for seeking fulfillment, for actually any type of activity where you set a goal and then go for it. Like you set a goal and you devise a plan, a step by step plan, and you sort of move toward it, right? When you're trying to achieve like flow states, this is just a human level. The universal soul is the explanation of that because the universal soul has done that. Like this whole cosmos is the emanation of the universal soul on its own goal seeking activity, and we partake in that. That's why we feel the need to always aspire for something more than like what we have now.
yeah.
Not just spiritual quest, but any type of sort of self improvement that we have. The universal soul is ultimately supplying us with those aspirations.
Well, yeah, I do have gripes with teleology, but I'm not gonna belabor that right now. I mean, I even if you think of the idea that there is some kind of harmony and mutual togetherness, and that even shows up in notions of entanglement, and things like that. I think that that's getting to what is being thought about by the world soul. Um, and I think your argument is right. What is it we need to explain? By the way, people have been hearing hypostases. This is break it up into its etymology. Hypostasis, that which stands under. So what it like meaning what is the basis of explanation for X? That's its hypostasis, right? And so, I mean, sometimes it gets translated as substance. I have problems with that too because of what's happened in the history of the idea of substance. But if you think about, whenever we're trying to understand, we're trying to get what is behind it or underneath it, that is the ground for it being explainable or understandable. Just so
Yes.
that's what he means when he's using that term. Well, I want to talk to you some more, but we should probably wrap it up for today. Um,
Sure.
so, I mean, one of the things that I'm taking away from this is, I suppose I'll leave it. Turn it with one last question. What what do you like? What do you individually, and what might Ismailis or Neoplatonic Muslims like? Neoplatonism isn't like, it didn't stop with Proclus, right? It keeps going on and on and on. Like you have Ficino, right, in Italy, and you have modern Neoplatonists today. You have Whitehead, who I think is really best understood as a Neoplatonist. And he's a Neoplatonist. He's showing what Neoplatonism looks like after the Einsteinian and quantum revolutions. Like, does that ever reverberate? Does it, or at least can it, reverberate back into Ismaili theology and say, oh, we should update our theology because there's been sort of updates in the Neoplatonism?
I missed part of what you said, but I think I think I caught what you're asking. So you're basically saying
I
that
gave the
there can
example of
is
Whitehead, or somebody who takes Neoplatonism past Einstein, past the
mm,
quantum revolution, and it's a significant rethinking of this. And processed
okay.
takes the place of substance, things like that. I would argue that, and many people would agree. I think Whitehead is a Neoplatonist through and through. I think he sees himself that way. Everything's a footnote to Plato. Um, and, and my question is, does that, like, so I don't think of Neoplatonism as dead and done. I think of it as a
Yeah.
living tradition. If it's a living tradition, it should feed back into the theology that has
Yes.
taken life from it in some ways. I
Yes.
mean, I mean in the good sense. Yes.
Well, I'll give you an example of how it's one way that it's sort of still very much alive for Ismailis in the Ismaili experience, even for people who don't know it. And I'll also share sort of what can some contemporary Ismailis have to say. So, we'll start with the latter. So, um, like every religious community, Ismailis are diverse,
Of course.
and there has been a general. This has happened to many Muslim communities and many Western Christian communities. Many people in the community, through migration and modern life, have just become out of touch with their own intellectual traditions. So
Right. Right.
just like many Christians are not aware of, most Orthodox Christians today who grow up already Orthodox are not going to know about a lot of their theology. Um, the same thing is happening in Muslim communities and Ismaili communities. Your average Ismaili might not know what Neoplatonism is. However, the Ismaili leadership, the Ismaili Imam for the past 50 years, um, he created the Institute of Ismaili Studies, and a lot of the texts that they publish into English are Neoplatonic texts. So there
Yeah.
seems to be an effort from the top to bring Ismaili Neoplatonic thought into the hands of community members where they have access to it, not as a dogmatic thing, but as a sort of look, if you're doing a personal search, this will be helpful to you. That's the only reason why I can be a Neoplatonist, because I was given access to my tradition through the funding of the Ismaili Imam, through the publication efforts that the late Aga Khan has undertaken. So now the material has made its way into the hands of many of us. Now, to that, there are three responses. The first response is indifference. It's, oh, this is very interesting. I feel proud that this is part of our heritage, but I'm going to go work my finance job now. Bye.
Yeah. Of
Okay,
course.
so
Yeah.
that's one response.
Yeah. Yeah.
The young, the professionalized class doesn't really care about theology. Okay, no problem. The second response, and you find this among some Ismaili academics, where they say that Neoplatonism should be treated like a museum. It's
Oh,
very nice to look at, but it's dead, and uh, we should not take it seriously anymore. We in fact, some of these people believe that no theology should be taken seriously anymore because they feel that only historicism is a legitimate form of inquiry. Okay,
Yeah.
so
I
I'm
have
sure
I
you've
have deep
encountered.
yes, and I have deep I mean, I practice history very seriously. I think I've demonstrated that, but I take historicism. I have deep abiding criticisms of it. So, but
Yeah.
go ahead.
So and so did Corbin, right?
Yeah,
I
yeah,
wrote one of my general exams on Corbin's criticism of historicism, where he said the problem here is historicism is a product of man. Man is
yeah,
not a product of historicism. So we have people like that. In fact, I mean, many of my colleagues who I have very good collegial relationships with, they are resolutely anti-Neoplatonic and anti-metaphysical. That's just how they see it. And we'll butt heads, you know, and argue about it, and then we'll just say, okay, we agree to disagree. So that's a second response. The
yeah,
third response is the type of thinking that I champion, which is to say, Neoplatonism is part of the Islamic and the Ismaili heritage. Uh, the current Ismaili Imam has said nothing against Neoplatonism. In fact, he continues to evoke Neoplatonism even in public speeches, and therefore this is something that we have to take seriously. And me as a professional, this is why I'm talking to people like you, is I'm trying to bring Neoplatonism back into like the contemporary discussions of the intelligentsia of our society,
yeah,
as a serious paradigm. But even apart from our, I mean, this is not really the ivory tower, but even apart from the ivory tower, for the Ismaili tradition, I mean, I'll give you an example of how Neoplatonism is still alive. So if you look up a speech of late Aga Khan the Fourth, right? In almost all his speeches, he talks about the unity of the human race and the
yeah,
need to accept pluralism of
yeah,
culture, religion, and then he quotes a verse of the Quran to back up his point. And the verse he quotes almost in every speech is where God says in the Quran, I'm paraphrasing, uh, "We have created all of you from a single soul." And the Aga Khan always focused on this verse. He kept saying in his interviews, like, God has created humankind from one soul, and therefore we all have this spiritual unity that underlies our various differences. That's a very Neoplatonic
very
idea,
Neoplatonic,
right?
very
Because
Neoplatonic.
Ismailis historically interpreted the verse the Aga Khan quoted as referring to the world soul.
Of
Like
course.
when the Quran says God created you from one soul, that's the world soul. And if there's a world soul, there's also an intellect, you know, that it emanated from. So this is a very practical example. The other way that this Neoplatonic paradigm really hits close for an Ismaili is who the Imam is. So in Ismaili belief, um, certain human beings who've developed and actualized the human state, certain human beings become reflections of the Neoplatonic hypostases.
Yeah, this is like theosis, very much. Yeah,
Yes. So for Muslims in general, for those Muslims who believe in Neoplatonism, we see Prophet Muhammad as a human mirror of the Neoplatonic nous or
mhm,
intellect. Like
right.
he's achieved a spiritual unity with that hypostasis. So everything Muhammad does is directly guided by the intellect and in conformity with it. And in the Shia tradition and in the Ismaili tradition, the Imam of the time is the reflection at a human level of the nous. So when you see the Imam, you're not just seeing like an earthly human, you are, but that earthly human is like a portal to
Yeah,
experience a glimpse of the Neoplatonic nous.
yeah.
And similarly, the Imam in his secondary role, what Ismailis call a peer, which I won't get into the details, but the Imam also holds a secondary position, which theologically is seen as the reflection of the world soul. So
That's
now,
very
when you
cool.
encounter the imam, even at a personal level, for Ismailis, you know, when the imam meets Ismailis, he'll give blessings, and he uses this phrase. Uh, he gives paternal blessings and maternal blessings. The paternal blessings is a reflection of the intellect, and the maternal blessing is a reflection of the soul. So for Ismaili spiritual life, the role of the imam is to reflect the hypostases to the community so as to help each individual. aspirant attain union with the soul and with the intellect. So that's how it's like a very living presence. Neoplatonism in it for Ismailis can be a very living presence, like in day-to-day life.
That's fantastic. We're gonna have to. I mean, that was joyous to hear. But we're gonna have to come to a close because we're Ben. Are we gonna shift and take questions now? Yep. So I hit stop, right? Is that correct? Thank you very much for all of those, and thank you, Khalil, for. We're just saying goodbye to the YouTube audience. Now we're going to pivot and talk to the lectern students.